Section 7 of Days with the Great Composers by May Clarissa Gillington Byron. Recording is in the public domain. Section 7 A Day with Mozart. On a dull November morning in the year 1791, a small, insignificant looking man, about 35 years of age, arose from a sleep of utter exhaustion. For he had been working late into the previous night. It was about 9 A.M. His wife Constanza had long been up and employed in the duties of that small poverty-stricken household man, wife, and two small children, and their little home in an unimportant street of Vienna. These duties, to Constanza, were not the easiest of tasks, for she was but a poor domestic manager and an inefficient, though devoted, mother and wife. As the slight, undersized man moved to and fro, dressing with rapid, graceful gestures, paying a great deal of attention to the powdering and peruking of his profuse brown hair, and decking out his person with nearly all the scanty ornaments he possessed, there was nothing in Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart outwardly to denote that amazing genius which made its dwelling in his slender frame. A dull fire smouldered in his languid, absent-minded eyes, but it was the fire of incipient fever. A slight flush tinged his usually pale cheeks, but it was a hectic and unhealthy flush. A certain childlike simplicity still remained, as though he were a case of arrested development in his features, expression, and deportment. The boy, whose fame began at 4 years old, had never yet really quite grown up. He had now discontinued his one-time practice of taking a ride by medical advice first thing in the morning. A species of curious nervousness induced by the rapid deterioration of his strength rendered him unequal to horse exercise, and his attenuated purse hardly allowed of it. For this man's life was a continual sheer fight for existence, a fight with fate and circumstances. It has been said that all the music created since Guido de Rizzo, who invented musical notation, to the end of the 18th century, had only one aim and object, to create Mozart, the greatest composer of whom I have ever heard, avowed his contemporary Haydn. But he was by no means a prophet in his own country. His honorary appointment as court conductor only brought him in £80 a year; and the master musician who at 12 had been the wonder of Europe, a prodigy, a kleiner Hexenmeister, a little magician, was now eking out his difficult days in an atmosphere of anxious penury, unrecognized, unacknowledged, overworked, his vitality almost expended. For a few minutes the composer knelt in prayer. The despondency which was gradually enshrouding him fell off for a while, revealing rifts of heavenly sunshine to his troubled mind. Again he reflected, in the words he had written as a youth, "I have God always before my eyes. I acknowledge His omnipotence. I fear His wrath, but I also acknowledge His love, His pity, and His mercy towards His creatures. Whatsoever is according to His will is also according to mine. Therefore I cannot fail to be happy and contented." And he rose from his knees refreshed. He went into the little living room and, without waiting for the somewhat unattractive breakfast which Constanza was preparing, he set to work upon a manuscript in his small, neat handwriting. He wrote standing up, for health's sake. Any cramped attitude was repugnant to his flexible and freedom-loving limbs. But indeed he could write in any position or under any circumstances. "I am, so to speak, so swallowed up in music," he averred, "that I am busy with it all day long. Speculating, studying, considering. And therefore the actual setting down of his ideas had become almost a mechanical, automatic process, like that which a clairvoyant might achieve. Even during the intervals of play at his beloved billiards or skittles, he was evolving or accumulating fresh matter, and he had but recently written down the score of Don Giovanni upon a stone table in a garden near Prague, while his friends laughed and talked at their game of bowls around him. To those who remember the solitary Beethoven communing with his own heart, or the long hours of isolation spent by many a great master at his pianoforte, this self-concentration of Mozart amid a crowd seems almost inconceivable. But he was one who took his greatness easily, and for whom difficulties, artistic ones, had, it may be said, no more than a momentary existence. He writes music, his wife declared, as other people write letters. Upon what, however, was he so sedulously engaged this morning as he covered page after page of music paper with his small, neat handwriting, while the air of depression which daily deepened on him sat heavily on his pleasant, simple face? Not here, for certain, was he transcribing some superb symphonic movement, some brilliant operatic scene. Here was no outcome of that almost antique joy of existence which had pulsed so exuberantly through Figaro and Giovanni. The tremendous words of the Dies Irae were visible and almost audible in the vocal score, and the melancholy of Mozart's countenance was enhanced by his belief that he was in the act of composing his own dirge; for he had headed it Requiem de Me, W. A. Mozart, and he was inspired by a settled conviction, intuition, call it what you will, that he would die at the conclusion of this task. All its circumstances were ominous and mysteriously foreboding. The composer had been working, 2 or 3 months before, upon his magnificent opera Die Zauberflöte, the Magic Flute, when a lean, tall stranger, clad in ghostly gray, suddenly appeared before him and handed Mozart an anonymous letter, with a query as to how soon he could complete a requiem for voices and orchestra, and for how much. Mozart replied by naming a period of about 5 months and a sum of about £100, immense wealth to him. The stranger returned subsequently with half the money, and promised the rest upon delivery of the manuscript. But all information as to his name or sender was scrupulously concealed. He was, as a matter of fact, the steward of a certain Count Walsegg, who desired to purchase a Mozartian score and produce it as his own composition. From that day forth Mozart was a doomed man. His natural light-hearted, mischievous vivacity, akin to the spontaneous mirth of a child, began to ebb and wane. An unaccountable gloom pervaded all his thoughts, and his debilitated constitution was laid open to the subtle onslaught of the most malignant bacilli. However, today he was temporarily more like himself, and as he sat down to his badly made coffee and hot roll, his kindly little face was all a-sparkle with smiles towards his wife and babes. Constanze Mozart was not the ideal wife for a man of his temperament, good-hearted and affectionate though she might be. She had no talents, no education; her nature was essentially commonplace, and her capabilities beneath those of the average German Hausfrau. She occupied, indeed, the not very elevated position of a makeshift, for Mozart had loved, had never ceased to love, her brilliant and beautiful sister Aloysia; and when fate and poverty denied him that charming creature, he selected, like many other men, another member of the same family, of vastly inferior caliber. Mozart, however, made the best of his stupid, good natured Constanze. Is not the pleasure of a fleeting, fickle passion, he wrote, as far removed from the bliss which a reasonable love procures as earth is from heaven? He encouraged her to cultivate her second rate abilities of singing and playing, and took pleasure in pointing out to his relatives that she made all her own dresses and bonnets, that, though always very poorly clad, she was irreproachably clean. She even does her own hair every day. Perhaps, indeed, a more highly strung and emotional woman might have been less fitted to companion so erratic a genius. For Mozart was at the mercy of every flatterer and impostor, no less than he was the dupe of his own generous instincts. Carelessly lavish by nature, he had made many a desperate attempt towards economy and methodical expenditure, attempts invariably frustrated by some calamity, such as one of Constanze's frequent illnesses, or the collapse of some hoped for financial assistance, or the ill success of a composition. Mozart was a very human little man, nothing upon stilts or highfalutin about him. A few moments' natural, homely intercourse over the coffee cups, and he was the old Mozart once more, quick, restless, gay, the marvel who, whilst busy with the most serious things of his art, could jest and make merry in the pleasantest and most careless manner. He danced to and fro about the room to amuse the children, now imitating some peasant folk dance, all heel and toe, now the courtly measured movements of some minuet or gavotte. For he was a born dancer, an enthusiast in the poetry of motion, and often declared that his true taste and vocation lay in that art rather than in music. You can feel this tendency in all his dance form compositions. The rhythmic sway and inherent gestures of dancing leaves, of nodding flowers, are there; the exquisite poise and symmetry of a supple and flexible nature. The minuet with its trio was still an accepted desideratum of symphonic form, and to what delightful use he put it! It was characteristic of him that his most lovely minuets were composed under the storm and stress of troubles mental and financial. They have the first fine, careless rapture of the early world. While outwardly, it would seem, he envisaged splendid lord and lady treading stately steps together, with woven paces and with waving arms, inwardly he sang of the daedal stars, sang of the dancing earth, like Pan in Shelley's poem, and felt, like a new Orpheus or Amphion, the whole world dancing to his magic flute. And so in the great G major and G minor symphonies he had, as Wagner says, breathed into his instruments the passionate fervor of the human voice, to which his genius with all-pervading love inclined him, as if in restless anxiety to impart to the melody, by way of compensation for its exposition by instruments only, the depth of feeling of the human voice. Thus he raised the capacity of instrumental music for soul expression to a height which enabled it to express the whole depth of the infinite yearning of the heart. Presently a young lady of noble family arrived for her daily 2 hours' lesson. She had been receiving this for months, but had never paid a kreutzer, a state of affairs still not unknown to the music master of aristocratic families. Mozart, though painstaking and conscientious, was hardly a successful teacher. He had neither the methodical system nor the obsequious toadyism which the manners of that day demanded. He had but little respect for rank or wealth, and refused most pertinaciously to play before audiences who were possessed of more titles than taste. This in itself had gone far to injure his prospects. Any reader of Consuelo may easily gather how dependent upon patronage was the unlucky musician in 18th-century Vienna. Our wealth, Mozart had avowed, dies with us, for it is in our brains, and no one can take it from us unless he cut off our head. And then, he added with his customary insouciance, we should not require anything any more. Nevertheless, to pupils who exhibited any trace of talent, earnestness, and a genuine desire to get on, he unfolded the best that was in him. He considered the chief points of a pianist to be a quiet, steady hand, the power of singing the melody, clearness and neatness in the ornamental passages, and a command of technique which should be equal to all purposes. His high-born pupil, however, was apt to rebel against what she considered his faddiness and fastidiousness; and on being gently set right for the 50th time, "Ach, lieber Herr Mozart," she exclaimed, "why not show me yourself how this piece should be performed? Example will be better than precept." The great virtuoso changed places with her at the clavier. Merely to see his slim, shapely little hands gliding over the keyboard was a pleasure to the eyes; but the exquisitely sympathetic playing which, as Haydn had said, "went straight to the heart," was wasted on the frivolous young Fräulein. She was wholly taken up with regarding him in astonishment and curiosity. He had become a different and an ennobled person. His simple, insignificant little face was transformed and illumined, as impossible to describe, so one of his friends had said, as it would be to paint sunbeams. His weak and restless eyes were calm and steady. Every movement of every muscle responded to and indicated the thoughts which his music expressed. He was lost to all external things. Suddenly he pulled himself up with a jerk, as though he had come down suddenly with a bump to earth. "You understand?" he said to the young patricienne. "You perceive that thus it should be played?" "I perceive," said she, with a shrug and pout, "that it is thus you are able to play it." The master sighed, and the irradiating light died away out of his features. "Alas," he murmured to himself, "I am not fortunate in my attempts to give lessons." Indeed, the man who had stamped so violently at a recent orchestral rehearsal that his steel shoe buckle flew in two was by no means suited to the patient methods of pianoforte instruction. "The time is not quite up," he presently continued, "but I will postpone the rest of your lesson. For I have a work in hand which lies very near my heart, and until that is finished I can think of nothing else." So the young lady returned home, and grumbled volubly at the gross inattention of Kapellmeister Mozart, to the indignation of her noble parents; and the noble parents decided that henceforth she should receive tuition from one of the open rivals and bitter enemies of Kapellmeister Mozart, men who held the ear of the Emperor, and whose compositions were loud in the land: Salieri, to wit, and Kotzebue, Grabisch, and Strack, with whom, dear child, she was assured, you will be enabled to do proper justice to your talents. Herr Mozart is a very much overrated man. We have heard that all his pupils are gradually falling off. The overrated man meanwhile had resumed work on his Requiem, upon which he was lavishing the whole wealth of his resources, when a fresh interruption occurred, in the shape of Schikaneder, his impresario. Schikaneder was one upon whom at birth had been bestowed the celebrated three wishes of the mother for her son, de l'audace et toujours de l'audace. Uneducated and illiterate, recklessly spendthrift and dissolute, his native audacity brought him through every dilemma. He had recently produced Mozart's opera Die Zauberflöte at the Imperial Theatre with such success that from a very doubtful first night it matured into tremendous popularity. He had now looked in to give a few encouraging details to the composer regarding the triumphal progress of Die Zauberflöte, for Mozart had not conducted his work since the first two nights. This opera is not so familiar to the average music lover as are Figaro and Don Giovanni. Its libretto is tedious, involved, and fantastic, and its music less adapted to tickle the ear of the groundlings. Nevertheless, with this Mozart unlocked for his countrymen the sacred treasure of national art, and it made an impression upon the Viennese public such as no opera had ever produced before. In its varied and complicated score were to be found specimens of nearly every extant musical form, from the Lied to the chorale and fugue. The whole musical conception was pure German, unindebted to French or Italian tradition for an iota of its effect, and, intellectually speaking as regards the music, it was on a totally different plane from either the light-hearted, unmoral intriguery of Figaro or the brilliant comedy of Don Giovanni, that expression of a universal genius which could reproduce in music every emotion of the human heart, great and small, with equal truth to nature. Die Zauberflöte, in the mind of its composer, was a work of the loftiest and most mystical symbolism, and produces by its perfection an effect on the musical mind which, to quote Otto Jahn, is quite irresistible, animating it to more active endeavor and lifting it to an atmosphere of purest serenity. Unfeigned and childlike pleasure suffused the face of Mozart as he listened to the cheery boasting of Schikaneder. It would seem, thought he, that the perfect mastery over my art which I feel myself to have attained has culminated in a triumph such as is rarely permitted to mortals. At last, then, success and fame and the comfort of my dear ones are within reasonable distance. I have not toiled in vain. As Schikaneder poured forth his tale of increasing receipts, of redoubling applause, of praises showered upon the name of Mozart, the volatile musician was carried away by his delight. He embraced Schikaneder, he kissed Costanza, he held aloft his youngest child in his arms, and waltzed around the room with it, singing the birdcatcher's song from Die Zauberflöte. In short, he gave way to the wildest extravagances of his overbrimming vivacity. But a more serious mood succeeded. "The words of my father," said he, "are finding their fulfilment. For he told me in the days of my early manhood, 'It lies now in your own power alone to raise yourself to as high a position as a musician has ever attained. You owe all to the extraordinary talent bestowed upon you by the all gracious God, and it depends upon your own sense and behavior whether you become an ordinary musician, forgotten by the world, or a celebrated Kapellmeister whose name shall be handed down to posterity in books, whether you herd all together in a room full of squalling brats on a heap of straw, or spend a Christian life full of honor, pleasure, and profit, and die respected by all the world, leaving your family well provided for." Schikaneder, who did not consider the Mozart household to be very much more than a roomful of squalling brats, shrugged his shoulders and replied, "Jawohl! The world is at your feet, dear Mozart. Put aside the gloomy offsprings of ill health," and he waved his hand towards the requiem score, "for the public will shortly clamor for another opera, and you shall surpass all that you have hitherto achieved." With these words he bade farewell, declining the hospitable invitation of Constanze, and he ran into Stadler on the stairs. Stadler was not a man to wait until he was invited. He was a clarinetist by profession and a hanger on by occupation. Many a time had he traded on the weak good nature of Mozart; many a ducat, ill to be spared, and many a dinner, hard to be shared, had he wheedled out of the too pliant composer. Constanze shuddered in her heart when she heard his plausible voice at the door. But Mozart, exhilarated by the good tidings of Schikaneder, drew the visitor in with both hands and gave him an effusive welcome. They sat down to the scanty midday meal. Mozart, whose touch was so delicate upon the pianoforte, so exquisite upon the billiard cue, found his hands of little practical use in the most ordinary matters. It was with clumsy difficulty that he handled his knife and fork. He was, moreover, talking so excitedly all the while, full of high spirits and drollery, that he paid but little attention to the deficiencies of his dinner in both quality and quantity. Constanze, snatching a hasty mouthful occasionally, was busy with the two little children. So Stadler made the best use of his host's unobservant attitude, and proved himself an excellent trencherman. "Wolfgangerl," said Constanze, "thou hast hardly touched one morsel. Thou wilt assuredly fall ill, and then what will become of all thy fine expectations?" "I ill!" exclaimed her husband, forgetful of the rows of empty medicine bottles upon the chimney piece, for he had been dosing himself heavily of late. "What have I to do with illness? I have works to do, great works. I must surpass myself." "'Twill go vastly hard with thee, Wolfgang, to do that," observed Stadler, "for in what branch of the tone art shalt thou find new worlds to conquer? In symphony, in opera, in mass, in chamber music and pianoforte music, in lieder and in concertos, art thou not master above all? And a virtuoso, moreover, on violin, viola, organ, clavier, where will the list end? Is it not enough for any ordinary man to have written Don Giovanni only?" This gross and liberal flattery, though indeed it was no more than the truth, fairly intoxicated the mind of Mozart; for he, who in his childhood had been wont to weep, out of excessive modesty, when people praised him, was now responsive to the least word of encomium. Beyond a mortal man impassioned far, he sprang up, and seizing the hand of Stadler, "Yes, yes," he cried, pointing upwards, "the temple of fame holds wide its doors for me, and thou shalt accompany me, my best of friends." And seating himself at the pianoforte, he burst into the lovely phrases of Lassidarum, while Constanze, to humor his mood, sang the part of Zerlina in a small, pretty voice. She was only too pleased to see him less melancholy and hypochondriacal. Don Giovanni. "Hand locked in hand we'll wander, There shalt thou hear my vow. Come with me, darling, yonder, Whisper and answer now." Zerlina. "I dare and yet I dare not, A tremor chills my breast. Would that my doubtings were not, Thy love would make me blest." Don G. "Come then, my love, my treasure." Zerlina. "Dearly I purchase pleasure." Don G. "I'll change thy whole existence." Zerlina. "Vain, vain is my resistance." Both. "Come, come, beloved, O come! All pains and fears take flight In love's immortal light." Among all the love duets that were ever written, Lacidarum la mano remains unique in its stream of pure and thrilling melody, for melody, as Mozart once remarked, is the very essence of music. Every word finds its exact expression, every verbal phrase is transmuted into a correlative phrase of sound. The tender, insinuating grace of the cavalier, the shy hesitation of the yielding peasant maiden, and the brilliant, animated allegro which unites them both in an abandon of delight. The stentorian "Bravo! Bravo!" of Stadler recalled Mozart to ordinary terrestrial life. The garden of Don Giovanni, with its lights and flowers, faded before his eyes into the exceedingly plebeian appurtenances of his dingy home. And at this moment he recalled that he had an important engagement to fulfill at the house of his friendly patron, Prince Karl Lichnowsky. With a few words of explanation he left the room and, fastidious to the verge of foppery, proceeded to clothe and decorate himself so far as his limited wardrobe would allow. The taste and fashion of those times permitted of much more exuberance in the way of texture, color, embroidery, and ornament in men's attire than is now possible, and Mozart reemerged from his apartment like a butterfly from a chrysalis. Stadler, overwhelming him with compliments, seized the opportunity to borrow a ducat, and escorted him to the very door of Prince Lichnowsky's mansion, bedaubing him with adulation. Here was a very different scene from the narrow precincts of Mozart's own dwelling. Although he was, as has been said, no respecter of persons, and by no means one to fawn upon the great, he found in aristocratic Viennese society something akin to his best ideals. He found amusement, inspiration, invigoration, true affection, and real sympathy. He was not a persona grata at court. His opponents were malicious and powerful. But in a few noble houses, such as this, he was welcomed and appreciated, and became the very life and soul of the company. Whether playing pianoforte solos for their delectation, or taking part with his host in some piece of chamber music, or joining on equal terms in the general conversation, he was full of élan and spontaneous fun, pouring out the absurdest doggerel rhymes or the drollest of sayings. He was buoyant and open hearted as a child. Impossible to identify with Mozart the great artist, with Mozart the virtuoso and amazing genius. Among his auditors were Countess Thun, the charmingest, sweetest lady, as he described her, that I have ever seen in my life; Prince Kaunik, and a score of other notabilities, who vied with each other in homage to the dapper little man in his well worn suit. Other musicians were also present, young composers, singers, and performers, anxiously endeavoring to gain a hearing and secure a footing in a society where success, like kissing, goes by favor. To these younger members of his profession Mozart was always eager to extend a helping hand. He was full of generous impulses towards them, abundant in recognition of their talents and congratulations on their skill, for his childlike nature was absolutely devoid of jealousy or envy. He loved to applaud the rising genius of those who might become his own rivals, no less than to dwell with enthusiasm upon the merits of bygone masters. "Bach is the father of us all," he averred. "We are his children. Those of us who can do anything worth having have only learned it from him. And Handel, he can strike like a thunderbolt. He knows how to make great effects better than any of us when he chooses." Dearest of all to him, perhaps, was Papa Haydn, who had parted from him the previous year, bound for that rich and kindly England, after which Mozart hankered all in vain. "Papa," Mozart had told him affectionately, "you are not fitted for the great world, and you speak too few languages." "But my language," said the old maestro, "is understood all over the world." And they embraced with tears and forebodings. As Mozart sparkled and scintillated for a couple of brief hours, playing his little part in a world to which he could never hoped to belong, it was possible to understand the extraordinary verve and humor which characterized his operatic music. The serious, the half serious, and the frankly comic were so interblended in his work that it reads like a veritable excerpt from human life; for no human life is wholly barren of laughter and laughter provoking episodes. In the Nozze di Figaro, for example, truth of characterization creates a kind of halo round all the situations, equivocable as they are. The whole is transformed by the delicate and noble spirit which asserts itself throughout. The story, with its complicated and superficial intrigues, is but a trivial and unworthy thing, yet every moment of its development is rendered with such magnificent skill and truth in music as to raise it to a higher plane, on which we feel the throbbing of our own life blood, recognize the language of our own hearts, and are captivated by the irresistible charm of unfading beauty. For Cherubino, the saucy, masquerading page, released by Susanna from the cupboard where in the course of a whole tissue of deceits he has been concealed, we have little interest or regard; but for Cherubino, the youth on the edge of manhood, endeavoring to express the indefinable unrest of his boyish passion for an unattainable adored one, we thrill with the acutest sympathy, we vibrate in consonance with the poignant simplicity and celestial orchestration of Voi che sapete. Were ever phrases of nascent emotion so lucidly, so touchingly conveyed as on those flowing waves of sound; the voice executing the clear, lovely melody, while the strings pizzicato, to imitate the guitar, carry on the delicious accompaniment, whose delicate outline is shaded and animated in a wonderful degree by the wind instruments, the whole being of an entrancing beauty. Ye who are wise ones in love's dear lore, Ladies, now give me aid, I implore. Some of your wisdom to me impart. Say, is it love that preys on my heart? Nameless emotion, tender desire, Thrill me with pleasure, fill me with fire. Now as in winter icy I freeze, Now summer fervors my spirit seize. Still I am questing strange joys afar, Their names I know not, nor what they are. I sigh and murmur against my will, I pulse and tremble, I throb and thrill. From day and darkness my peace is fled, Yet mid my sorrows joy lifts its head. Say, O ye wise ones in love's dear lore, Is love the sickness I now deplore? As evening approached, Mozart reluctantly tore himself away from the congenial society of his friends and patrons. The transitory ebullition of gaiety which had exhilarated him died down. A reaction of malaise and despondency set in. "Can you order in some wood, Wolfgang?" said Constanze, as he entered their meagerly furnished room. "And will you pay for it, or give me the money to pay when it comes?" "I have no money," he replied uneasily, feeling in his various pockets. In truth, his last ducat had gone to Stadler. "If only you could write something that would sell immediately," sighed Constanze. "Schikaneder may talk of the immense success of Die Zauberflöte, but he does not bring you a pfennig of the proceeds. You should be more businesslike with him, Wolfgang." Dear Heaven! Was not a man without a kreutzer of income enough to do and to think of in a place like this? Groaned the Master. turning his eyes around the depressing and ill-conditioned room. "I tell you, Stenzel, I shall receive another 50 ducats when this requiem score is finished. Or rather, you will, for I shall not be alive to enjoy it. I feel that in the very roots of my heart, in the marrow of my bones." "Oh, that requiem! It is killing you. I shall make the doctor forbid it you." "Ah, dear husband, do not speak so!" And the foolish but devoted woman clasped him in her arms. "Nevertheless, 'tis so, my Stanzl. I feel as though the marble cold feet of death, like the statue's feet in Don Giovanni, were already entering towards me, who burn with an unaccountable fever." And withdrawing himself from her arms, he sat down at the clavier and began to sing the awful sentences of the Commandante, those soul harrowing sounds which embody the inflexible decree of an eternal law, and the heavy tread of the stone figure as it seizes the profligate hand. The Commandante. "Thou bad'st me to thy supper, I would return the courtesy. Come, answer me, come, answer me. Wilt thou, too, banquet with me now? Repent thee." Don Giovanni. "No." Commandante. "Yes." Don Giovanni. "No." Commandante. "Ah, now thy time is past." A chill descended upon the heart of Constanze, and a cold shiver ran down the spine of Mozart himself, as they realized the scene so familiar to both. The children, disturbed by the sonorous chords, awoke and began to cry. The canary started its shrillest song. "Ah, get thee gone, Wülfrl!" exclaimed Constanze, her anxiety, as is so often the case, finding vent in petulant words. "Get thee gone, and order in the wood, else we shall all freeze into stone statues ourselves." The master musician went out into the streets and round to the yard of the Silver Serpent, that little beer house where they sold fuel. "You look very ill, Herr Mozart," said Joseph Diner, the porter to whom he gave his instructions about it. "Ill, yes. I am ill, undoubtedly," and he passed his hand over his brow. "I feel as though I had been poisoned. I have enemies, you know, good Joseph." "A trifling indisposition, I trust, sir," said the porter, looking sympathetically at the pale, troubled face. "Will you pay now or on delivery? There is a little matter of 6 ducats already owing." "Then let this be added to the account," said Mozart. "I have a large sum due to me, good Joseph, as soon as my work in hand is accomplished. Let my creditors rest easy; they shall shortly all be paid in full." He walked away with a would-be jaunty air, and en route encountered one of his brother Freemasons. "You are not forgetting the cantata you promised for our Masonic festival?" inquired his friend. "It will be ready the day after to morrow," replied Mozart, who had not touched a line of it. "You will conduct, of course?" observed the other. "Of course, of course. I shall be delighted to conduct." "The libretto is attractive and suggestive to you?" "The libretto is Schikaneder's." "H'm," said the Freemason, who did not think much of Schikaneder. "And the subject is the praise of friendship. That at least should inspire my highest efforts," said Mozart with a faint smile. "My dear fellow," responded the other, "if you cannot rise to such a subject, who can? For fraternal affection, for sociability, for charity in a good cause, for desire to make your noble talents of use to your brethren, I do not know your equal, little Mozart, great Mozart. Adé, and good luck to you." They parted with a warm salute. "The doctor has been here," said Constanze as her husband came in. "He was sorry to have missed you, but I told him very carefully how ill you looked and all your symptoms. He left more physic for you, and he implores you not to work at night. "Oh, does he so?" remarked Mozart in absent‐minded tones. "Well, now, Stenzel, I am going to write my 'Praise of Friendship,' and you can tell me stories whilst I work." He sat down at his writing table, hunted up Schikaneder's manuscript from under a pile of papers, and began to meditate, pen in hand, remote for the time being in a world where he walked alone. Constanze, amiable and obliging, fetched her needlework and plunged into a fairy tale. Her soft, inexpressive voice went rippling gently on, like that of some unintelligent Teutonic Scheherazade, through half a dozen Märchen. Now and then Mozart burst out laughing at some quaint turn or fantastic event of the story. Sometimes he seemed utterly absorbed in the mere movement of his flying pen as it covered the paper. Gradually Constanze spoke in still more drowsy accents. By 11 o'clock her fair head had fallen on her breast; she was all but asleep. Mozart rose and, with kind solicitude, assisted her to their sleeping room. "Slumber well, my dear," said he. "Do not trouble about me. I shall retire shortly." But 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock came, and found him still, consumed with feverish energy, improvising at the piano, very softly, lest he should awaken his family. He had dropped the Masonic cantata and was back at work on the Requiem. It obsessed him, body and soul. Laborare est orare, and he put the whole force of his tender, emotional, devotional nature into the marvelous tone poem which he was constructing. The awful glory of the Judge enthroned, Rex Tremendae Majestatis, had given place to the marvelous supplication of the Recordari Quartet. Never in any art, be it what it may, has the comforting feeling of pious trust in the mercy of God, arising from the consciousness of human weakness, been more truly and beautifully expressed than here. As the dark November night attained its lowest ebb, that mystical period when all human powers and faculties are at their weakest, Mozart arose, or rather staggered up, and, hardly knowing how he undressed, lay down by the dreaming Constanze and the two children in their wooden cradles. Impoverished, outspent, death doomed as he already was, celestial consolations yet were his, and over his brain, too exhausted to formulate a prayer, the heavenly beseeching of the Recordari wandered to and fro. Recordari Jesu pie, quod sum causa tua viae, ne me perdat ille die, quarens me sediste lassus, redemiste crucem passus, tantus labor non sit casus. Think, good Jesus, 'twas to save me thou wast found in human fashion, cast me not from thy dear presence. Seeking me, thou satest weary, on the cross for me didst perish, let not all that toil be wasted. Section 7. A Day with Mozart.